I fully expected to go into this video proclaiming how I finally enjoyed Hyrule Warriors. I mean, to an extent that's kind of true, but not as much as I expected. Despite playing and giving up on the game twice in the past, both of those playthroughs were before I played Age of Calamity. I had always chalked it up to me just not being a fan of Musou gameplay at the time. I was hesitant to even try Age of Calamity for a while because of not being able to get into the original. But then I played it and fell in love. Tastes change and evolve over time, and since I enjoyed the second game in this now spin-off series, I didn't think it was too much to assume that I'd better appreciate the original. With a new Hyrule Warriors game being announced alongside the Switch 2, it was a pretty good push to finally get the original game off my backlog and beat it. And it was disappointing in a sense. I certainly had an easier time getting into it and had enough motivation to finally beat it, but I wasn't really hungry for more. I completed the main story and had little to no desire to engage with any of the other modes. Age of Calamity, on the other hand, I couldn't stop at just the main story. It's one of the few non-platforming games that I actively go out of my way to 100%, on all 3 playthroughs of the game I've done now. What I had initially thought was going to be a really simple video to work on ended up being a deeply challenging and introspective one, as I tried to search the deep recesses of my brain to establish why Hyrule Warriors fails, where Age of Calamity succeeds. I suppose at the core, the story is quite a large part of it. Stories are the primary motivator for seeing a game through to the end. In this sense, it's quite easy to understand why I couldn't get into it on those initial playthroughs. I think the first game fumbles its narrative hard. At its core, Hyrule Warriors is a piece of officially licensed fan fiction. I say this as a compliment. It makes no attempts at hiding this fact. The problem is that I don't think they go far enough with it. The basic premise is that a sorceress watches over the timeline and falls in love with the hero. Heartbroken that she can't be with him, she decides to go on a quest to defy fate and force the hero to fall in love with her. I had heard people describe the story for years, and if I'm being honest, I think that those descriptions are more interesting than what the game actually portrays. Yeah, I have a few problems with it. For one, the pacing is way too fast. Moments don't get any room to breathe. It's always on to the next point as soon as one is introduced. This means there's really no weight to characters like Midna and Darunia meeting, and no room to really explore the implications of this timeline manipulation. Really, there isn't any weight to these portals opening up, so it makes this idea of all these characters and locations coming together feel too superficial. Generally, large portions of the screen time are given to these original versions of Link, Zelda, and Impa. They're barely even sidekicks, and it's such a waste of an opportunity. To be honest, any old Zelda character could fit their roles and interactions, so it's really not that special seeing them. They do the same twist that Ocarina of Time did with Sheik, which makes every single scene a waiting game to see if they'll finally just reveal her as Zelda. Why not just get Sheik from Ocarina of Time at that point? At least a twist that it's a different Zelda would have been kinda neat and a little subversive. Not to mention that on the original character front, we have one of my least favorite depictions of Link. Really, it's for the simple fact that they try to give him a character arc. This is fundamentally counter to the entire point of his existence as a character. Link growing arrogant after getting the Master Sword and needing to learn to not rely on perceived strength or whatever feels wrong. Not only is this something that we are told and never shown, great storytelling there, but I also feel like Link should never actually be prideful. His growth is usually tied to physical strength, not his internal character. He's meant to inspire change in others, and by getting stronger, he's able to inspire change more effectively. He's the conduit through which other characters grow, because his core character has no room to actually grow. Look at any mainline game in the series and you'll see that this is fundamentally true. This is also the worst version of Ganondorf. He lacks everything that makes him one of my favorite fantasy villains. The core thing that makes him more than a generic megalomaniacal maniac. He has a specific vendetta against the Kingdom of Hyrule due to perceived slights against him, generally perceiving them as inferior and perhaps even morally bankrupt for not using their power the way they should. Even Twilight Princess, which is often criticized for its portrayal of Ganondorf, helps expand the themes of identity and duality. He presents himself as a god, more than just a mere mortal, and he ends up dying at the hands of the man he tricked. There's nothing remotely interesting about this version of him. It wasn't until this game that I realized how important Ganondorf's personal vendetta against Hyrule was. It adds flavor to the character that a mere "I want to destroy the world" ever could. Even ignoring that, he isn't intimidating like an Ocarina of Time. He doesn't have thematic ties that justify overshadowing the real villain like Twilight Princess. He isn't introspective from being imprisoned for millennia like the Wind Waker. In my first playthrough of Tears of the Kingdom, I thought he was legitimately scary, and his boss fight cemented him as a genuinely threatening character. But in Hyrule Warriors, he just exists. Ganondorf's inclusion is even more obnoxious when you realize Cia, the game's actual new villain, has a far more interesting motivation. She's doing all this because she's in love with someone who will never love her back, and won't even know of her existence without her interfering. Outside of the characters, there's not a whole lot to the narrative. Just close some portals, get the Master Sword, and beat Ganondorf. Oversimplification? Maybe. I can't tell, I can barely remember, and I beat the game only a couple of days ago. Age of Calamity, on the other hand, I have a lot to say about this one. For starters, Age of Calamity is canon, actually. I know that a lot of people dismiss it because of apparent inconsistencies, but the truth is that most of these inconsistencies come from Masterworks. Look, I love this book and the insights it gives on Breath of the Wild, but I kind of hate that it's become this bedrock foundation for all lore across this era of the series. Seriously, if you ignore Masterworks, the vast majority of inconsistencies across Tears of the Kingdom and Age of Calamity instantly disappear. If you ask me, while books can be canon, they should never be considered more canon than the actual games. Because Breath of the Wild is not a book. It is a video game. Therefore, video games should be held in higher canonical regard than books. Especially when it is the exact same people who came up with the lore stuff in that book who oversaw and had to approve everything in Age of Calamity. The story instantly fixes itself if you just ignore Masterworks. For instance, in the book, it says that Link got the Master Sword years before becoming Zelda's knight. This is the only place that says, what? Why is it knight? It should be Knight. What? How did I forget the K, bro? This is the only place that says when Link got it. You won't find anywhere in Breath of the Wild that says when Link obtained it. All we know is that it was before Mipha met Link in Zora's Domain and said that he changed, as stated in Mipha's diary in that game. In Age of Calamity, she specifically calls out how Link hasn't changed, because he doesn't have the Master Sword yet. This is a very tiny detail that shows that they absolutely knew what they were doing, and weren't just making changes for the sake of it. Personally, I think that saying Terrako went back in time to the day Link got the Master Sword, causing him to get it later, is a very reasonable explanation. It contradicts the book, but the book isn't the same medium. A book whose purpose was to show the development process of Breath of the Wild, not just give supplemental lore. Just because there's a big lore section doesn't mean that's the only worthwhile content within the book. A lot of the non-lore stuff is ignored, even though I'd argue it's more interesting, but that's not the point of this video. It also doesn't mean that the developers aren't allowed to change their minds in the future if it means creating new stories set within this world. With all this in mind, is it really so crazy to assume that the game under the supervision of the same team interviewed for that book, who had to approve every gameplay design decision and every story beat, is canon? Okay, let's talk about the story now. It's not a prequel in the traditional sense. It takes place in an alternate timeline in which the heroes win. This has led to a lot of people feeling like it was falsely advertised, but I think that's an over-exaggeration. It's not meant to be an exact retelling of the events leading to Breath of the Wild. It's meant to fill in the gaps. Using information we learned from this game, we can infer and interpret Breath of the Wild with more clarity. The game is supplemental. It exists in a bubble and is self-contained enough to function on its own. But you really do need to play Breath of the Wild to get the most out of it. I think that the game's happy ending actually serves to make Breath of the Wild story more tragic. This is honestly the story's biggest strength: dramatic irony. It can be laid on a little thick occasionally, like in the Gerudo DLC level, where Urbosa says that it will take Master Koga 100 years to master the Thunder Helm, and we see that in Breath of the Wild, it's been 100 years and he's mastered the Thunder Helm. Other than that one, it's pretty cool. My favorite scene in the game is the one where Zelda and Rome reunite. It's really sweet to see Rome admit his failures, and to see that despite how harsh her father was, Zelda was still able to forgive him. This is a nice scene, but we know that in Breath of the Wild, they never got this. They never reconciled in the Prime timeline, and it adds a melancholic layer to the scene that enhances both games. I also like how it depicts Link and Zelda's relationship. In this game, though she still views Link as a symbol of everything she must become but isn't able to, she isn't openly hostile towards him. By getting the Master Sword later, it lets her see his true character without the filters of assumed antagonism she thought he had towards her. He's put in the exact same situation she is, destiny forced upon him. We see that the same themes and ideas that were baked into Breath of the Wild story are also baked into this one. Breaking conventions, rewarding out-of-the-box thinking, and punishing following the past. The reason the heroes win this time is because Terrako forces them to think outside the box. He forces them off the beaten path. Forces them to use a creative solution. I'm gonna call them sages because of Tears of the Kingdom. Yes, I know Tiba isn't a sage. Shut up. Anyway, I like the inclusion of the sages in this game. I think getting to see their interactions with the champions is a neat bit of fanfiction-y goodness. It also does a decent job at laying the groundwork and informs who they are in Tears of the Kingdom. Sidon gets a chance to save his sister, but he knows it won't last. There's a moment when he talks to his younger self saying that he'll always be there. Adult Sidon pauses for a moment as he realizes that he'll have to return to his timeline where she's dead. We then see that he's afraid of leaving the domain and wants to protect it so he doesn't lose his fiancée in Tears of the Kingdom. This behavior feels pretty consistent if we consider that a fresh wound would have just been opened up. Yunobo is still unsure of himself, looking up to Link for being one of the only people who wants to fight by his side, with Daruk helping instill confidence in himself. We see in Tears of the Kingdom that Yunobo is quicker to jump into action and can overcome his confidence issues without external validation. Riju gets the opportunity to fight alongside Urbosa and gets the reassurance that she can lead her people. It's definitely the least obvious change, but you do get the sense that she's a more confident warrior in Tears of the Kingdom compared to previously. Tulin is the most obvious bit of foreshadowing to Tears of the Kingdom of them all. He looks up to Rivali and wants to be exactly like him, even vowing to match his skill. We see in Tears of the Kingdom that he's very close to being brash and arrogant like Rivali, being skilled and letting pride and ego build up because of that. What I'm trying to get at is that Age of Calamity feels like a really good midpoint between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom for these characters. While it's an optional point to experience, it does actually make their progression across the games feel more natural. I like getting to see more of the champions and what their dynamic was. Just seeing more of them was the exact thing I wanted from the story. Mipha wanting to train with Daruk, Rivali being a pompous brat that no one really likes, that sort of thing. It's just nice to get a game where they have some screen time. This is also the game that solidified Master Koga as my favorite secondary antagonist to ever grace the series. He's a goofy, kind of dumb, but also deeply loyal leader. Knowing how in the Prime timeline he remains an enemy against Zelda, it makes this moment where he's willing to put it all behind him and swear loyalty to her for the sake of his group incredibly strong. He's really only loyal to Ganon up to the point that he follows whatever greater power won't harm his group. Speaking of villains, that's really the only blemish that I think the story has. In 2020, I think I liked Aster because it was nice to have a prominent antagonist in the Wild era who was intelligent and had some real agency instead of being a mindless rage monster. After Tears of the Kingdom and how well Ganondorf is handled though, yeah, Aster's pretty milquetoast. He fits the theme well enough, a guy trying to ensure destiny plays out and that it all follows conventions. But I don't know, he's just kind of evil. I guess it's kind of creepy and disturbing watching him rip the souls out of the bodies of the Yiga clan. I don't know, he's just kind of there. I think he's about as boring as Ganondorf from the first game, but at least this time it's an original boring character and not an interesting character that they made boring. Also, I don't know where to put this, but the audio mixing is terrible and I have no idea what the heck happened with it. It almost sounds like one of my early videos. That's all I have to say. Let's talk about the gameplay now. The actual gameplay is a lot closer in quality, though Age of Calamity still has a lot of smaller improvements that vastly improve how the game feels to play. The basic premise is that you are a one-man army against a horde of 1,000 enemies. It's an acquired taste, one that I've steadily gained over the years. I do think that playing for extended periods of time does make it feel repetitive and grindy, but I think there's a bit more depth to it than you might initially think. You've got a bunch of different characters to play as with distinct playstyles and combos that adds a lot of variety to the game. Though outside of missions that force you to play as certain characters, there's not a whole lot to incentivize experimentation once you find your favorites. This is an issue across both games, and it's the sole aspect that I think Age of Calamity doesn't really improve upon its predecessor. Early on, it's fun to experiment to try and find who you gel with, but in the latter half of both games, experimentation doesn't get you anything but levels and advancements that just feel more worthwhile going to someone you actually like to play as, rather than risking on a character you don't like as much. This means that a lot of the variety and depth that the games offer feel a little more obfuscated because it takes a little too much effort to force you to engage with that variety. I don't have too much to say about the different characters. I guess that Hyrule Warriors feels more balanced in that the characters are a very similar amount of fun to play as, while in Age of Calamity, the most fun characters exceed that of the original, while the least fun are substantially worse than anything in the prior game. Then again, part of that might be because I don't really want to take the time to learn any other character. I remember hating Riju and Yunobo on my first couple of playthroughs, but then I had to learn them and found that while they still aren't my favorites, they're perfectly fine. In this sense, the characters feel like they have more depth in learning how they work in Age of Calamity compared to the more pick up and play nature of them in Hyrule Warriors. I think an easy solution to this problem would be to have the missions lock you into using certain characters with an even spread among them all so that they all have a chance to shine. Then, once you beat the stage, you're able to pick whoever you want if you want to go back to look for secrets or whatever. This is exactly how the DLC stages work, and I like that I was forced to use these different characters that I barely touched previously. If the game as a whole was designed like that, I think this issue would be solved completely. Alas, they didn't have that idea until it was too late. Really, it's everything that surrounds the character you're playing as that makes the games engaging. The core of beating hundreds upon hundreds of enemies at a time is quite satisfying, but there is actually a bit of strategy that goes into beating the different stages. Keeps and outposts are something consistent across every stage, each one acting as a stronghold that will produce allies for whichever side controls them. Which means that depending on how many you've captured versus how many your enemies have captured will directly result in how many forces each side has. On top of this, there are a variety of missions that the game will ask you to complete as you make your way through the battlefield, which generally spices things up a fair amount. The basic idea is that you're asked to prioritize how much of a focus on the battlefield you want in comparison to how much of a focus on the little goals that will progress you to the end of the stage. This keeps the game balanced and makes killing hordes of enemies feel more purposeful and less like a mere power fantasy. There's a gauge that increases your attack power, and deciding if you want to use it on a horde or save it for a more powerful enemy provides some nice split-second decision making. But the real highlight of the combat are the more powerful enemies. The way they work is that they aren't just damage sponges who hit harder. They have this defense gauge, which once empty allows you to do a powerful attack. This system feels quite underdeveloped in the original game. I don't know, I just can't recall many instances of it changing my strategy around bosses and powerful foes. Outside of them finishing their combos, there aren't many opportunities to break their defense, so the system feels superfluous. Adding to the superficiality issues are the items. Just like in the classic Zelda games, throughout the adventure you'll get items. They don't really get utilized outside of context-sensitive situations though. Technically, this is also the case with those older games, but in Hyrule Warriors there are so few of these moments that I often forgot I even had them. Age of Calamity is where this defense gauge becomes an integral part of the combat, and makes every single major enemy combat encounter a real joy. For starters, the Sheikah Slate is a massive improvement over the items, and most of them have more than a single application. Cryonis stops enemies who rush at you or freezes enemies in water. Stasis freezes enemies in place, which can be used on a horde or larger foes. Magnesis is pretty lame, as I can't recall a single instance in any of my playthroughs where I used it outside of context-specific scenarios. The bombs are by far the best though, as they can be used for crowd control, and more crucially, they will always help chip away at the defense gauge no matter if it's a context-specific attack or not. Now, you can't just spam these all willy-nilly, there's a cooldown period. This adds a fun bit of strategy, as you have to time when you use them accordingly. Do you want to hold off on using them unless you really need it? Or is it worth using it and potentially leaving yourself unable to access them when you really need them? Each character uses them in different ways too, so it adds a lot of variety and spice to how you approach each battle. Beyond the Sheikah Slate, you also have 3 other methods of depleting the defense gauge. One is by flurry rushing the enemy, just like in Breath of the Wild. It's subtle, but it makes each enemy encounter more engaging than just wailing on them. I'm not sure I'll be able to show footage for reasons I'll get into later, but there are times where I'll be dodging one enemy, only to enter a flurry rush for some enemy I wasn't even close to. Otherwise, it's a fun little skill-based thing that can help you as you strategize taking down larger baddies. You can also get headshots on the enemies to stagger them, either by using attacks that get you airborne or Link's incredibly overpowered bow attack. It feels nice to chain this with other attacks that deplete the gauge. Finally, you have the elemental rods that will always stagger the enemy. But there's a Rochambeau element at play where if you use a fire rod on an ice enemy, for instance, it will stagger them even more and allow you to practically eviscerate their defense gauge. You get these by defeating certain elemental enemies and the Wizropes on the map, which gives you yet one more thing to prioritize in your overall battlefield strategy. All of these options really make the defense gauge the real core of Age of Calamity's combat, and it's what elevates it beyond a repetitive, grindy snooze fest. I assume that the original game would function similarly to this one in regards to the defense gauge, and I suppose that's really the core of why I prefer the second game to the first. Now let's get into an Age of Calamity specific thing, the Divine Beasts. I don't like them. On paper, it's a cool idea. In Breath of the Wild, they were just the game's dungeons, glorified landmarks. Here, though, we get to experience them as the weapons of war they were meant to be. Unfortunately, the actual experience of piloting these things around isn't great. They don't feel that great to control, especially in handheld mode. Sure, they are these big, lumbering beasts, but even with that in mind, they still feel a little too awkward for my liking. Valmetto's sections in particular I hate the feeling of. They are different in how they attack, which does add a little variety, but there's never any depth in the mission structure beyond killing a bunch of enemies, which gets stale real fast. Probably the worst part of the game as a whole. One thing I'm sort of mixed on with both games is the overall side content outside of the missions. There's a lot to do in both games, but the core thing you're doing is the same thing that you do in the main stages. Hyrule Warriors has an adventure mode with a cute aesthetic with this little recreation of the original Zelda game's map, but otherwise I don't really think it offers too much that I didn't get from the base game. The process of looking for secrets feels too obtuse due to being tied not to just completing the stages, but doing well in the stages. Progress ends up feeling stagnated because the game doesn't communicate what getting a good rank really entails in the missions. You could say the same thing with Age of Calamity's map, but I think this game does something that makes the experience more engaging. For one, there's no ranking system, so just beating the stage is enough. I think what the game opts to do instead is generally more fulfilling than the ranking system. By completing missions and defeating enemies, you'll get material drops. This feeds into a system of upgrading your characters by unlocking new combos, increasing a character's max hearts, giving them another gauge, etc. This does mean that sometimes you'll be playing certain stages over and over again to grind for materials, but if you're only focusing on a few characters instead of all of them, it cuts down on the repetition by a substantial amount. On top of materials, there are also Korok seeds to find. These two systems make the exploration of the battlefield quite enjoyable, and it encourages you to actually pay attention instead of shutting your brain down as you run from one location to the next. The problem I have with all this is that it all happens on a static menu. There are these descriptions of stuff that's going on, but I wish that we actually got to see that stuff. I guess I just wish that there was a bit more interaction with the actual world of Hyrule. Perhaps they could have set up a little hub area around where the towers are that you could hang out in. Spread the quests around these hub areas as we get to see the actual characters get to talk to all these people. Would definitely make it less dull, and offer a nice little downtime in between the battles. Plus, getting to see Hyrule in its glory days before Calamity Ganon came and destroyed it all outside of set dressing for the stages would have been pretty cool. I was going to talk about the DLC for the original to compare it to Age of Calamity, but I don't really have a fair point of reference for how the DLC really transforms the experience of the first game, having only really played the definitive edition on Switch, which includes everything. I can't really determine what is or isn't DLC content without looking it up. Overall, it's just kind of more. The base game is fine enough that more isn't inherently a bad thing, but it does make it feel less worth it unless you're a die-hard fan. Not like this point really matters, since let's be real here, you are only ever going to play this game on the Switch, but still, I think it's notable how both games handled expansion. The DLC for Age of Calamity is split into two halves, just like Breath of the Wild. One adds a bit more gameplay content, and the other adds more story content. I like battle-tested Guardian, and the flail weapon is actually pretty fun to use, and I find myself swapping between them and the Master Sword quite often. Outside of that, I don't really care for the first DLC wave. The vicious monster battles are dreadful. It's kinda neat at first. You've gotta try and find the monster on the map. Then you'll find out what special attributes it has that makes it different from the regular variation. But the limited pool of locations and enemies makes it a very dry experience pretty fast, especially since the most common attribute is that they're damage sponges. Seeing Zelda on the Master Cycle is a funny visual, but otherwise I don't particularly care for it. I do like how these missions are in a separate map and how it asks you to engage with the new stuff, but with the majority of the new stuff being the vicious monster battles, it's hard to care for them. The second wave DLC is where the good stuff is at. Mainly it's because the main stages are by far the best piece of content in the game, and I wish more of the base game stages functioned like them. There's how they handled characters that I mentioned earlier, but beyond that they also have these little side missions that you can try to complete. These are pretty fun and further reduce any monotony you might feel going through them, especially since the third one is usually left blank, forcing you to experiment and explore in order to figure out what the objective is and how you should complete it. The actual story isn't expanded much, but the characters are, and it's just a few nice scenes that flesh them out that little bit more. I hate the idea of mutated Ganon because it begs the question of why he never shows up later on if these are meant to take place during the Calamity before they reunite with King Rome on the Great Plateau. But I guess they needed a final boss for the DLC, so whatever. Last point, the presentation. Don't have a whole lot to say here, so this shouldn't take long. I do not care for the genre of music that Hyrule Warriors goes for. Honestly, the electric guitar with distortion is a bit of an abrasive sound to me, and there are very few songs that I like which include it. I'm not gonna go around demonizing it. It is a very popular sound that a lot of people vibe with, and they're not wrong for liking that sound. Heck, I kinda like the Skyloft arrangement they did for this game. It's just not generally my cup of tea, and Skyloft is the only real exception. Pretty much every song that doesn't include those distorted electric guitars is in my Zelda playlist though, and I do like most of these arrangements. Age of Calamity wouldn't really work with that sort of sound, but even so, it doesn't try to emulate Breath of the Wild either. It's more orchestral than Breath of the Wild, and this soundtrack is way more up my alley. I think I prefer Breath of the Wild's more ambient focused sound, but I also do get a kick out of these more energetic orchestral sounding tracks. I love how they transformed the champion themes from more somber, personal themes to these grander compositions that emphasize that they are skilled warriors. This version of the Lost Woods theme is tied with the one from Ocarina of Time as my absolute favorite. It is so good that it makes listening to the original feel really boring and basic in comparison. I like the arrangements they do for the Guardians. Crescendo is a cool variation of Breath of the Wild's main theme, though I think placing it when taking back Akala Citadel is a tad strange for the placement rather than when Zelda awakens her power, as that is a far more narratively significant moment, but whatever. The main theme is cool, and with how often they play that 4-note motif, it is impossible to forget. I don't have a problem with it looping over the map, but if people muted the game during this part, I'd get it. I think that the original game feels kinda cheap, but it's hard to really blame the game for that. The game's roughly 200,000 sold copies during launch week in the West being more than expected says to me that the budget for the game can't have been that high. I will commend them for getting the game to run at 60 FPS in docked mode on the original Switch, though the sacrifices needed to get that frame rate are a little unfortunate. There's an overall lack of detail and a drab simplicity that permeates throughout the game. For a Wii U game that was expected to only be remotely profitable in the Japanese market, I think it's forgivable. It's not like it's ugly or anything, and if there's one positive, it's that I do like these character designs. A nice mix of Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword with an anime tint. In particular, I absolutely love the blue scarf they gave Link. It's a unique touch that also just adds a nice pop of color against the green. Easily one of my favorite looks for him in the whole franchise. I just bit my tongue and it's bleeding. I'll preface Age of Calamity by saying that I played the game on Switch too, and while it was generally a fine experience, there were a couple of hiccups. Whenever there were a bunch of particles and effects on screen, it would crash. This one cutscene repeated itself a couple of times.
Well, it's time. Well, it's time.
And there were other such hiccups throughout my playthrough. I did notice frame drops, though it didn't seem to be quite as bad as it was on the original Switch. It's definitely something that feels like it will get better as the software translation layer improves over the system's life, and it was only a pain during specific missions. The real pain point was that I found this game incredibly difficult to play in docked mode. On my 4K monitor, it's really blurry, and while I'm not generally a frame rate snob, it was rough getting into this one. Shortly before playing Age of Calamity for this video, I played the Switch 2 versions of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and the rock solid 60 FPS and 1440p upscaled to 4K was a real treat. So much of one that this game looking and feeling so similar to those ones made the frame rate being halved incredibly difficult to adjust to. I basically had no choice but to play handheld if I wanted any chance at being comfortable enough to play, which is why most of the footage isn't actually mine. This is actually a compliment, because it highlights what I think is one of the most impressive things about this game. It truly feels like something the Zelda team would make. It feels like it belongs next to Breath of the Wild. Obviously, the Zelda team helped out, but there's an anecdote about how of the overall time it took to develop it, the grass took half of that amount of time to develop. To me, this shows that the folks over at Koei Tecmo had a lot more to do with the overall feel of the game than the main Zelda team, especially since they were busy working on the most technically advanced game in Nintendo's history at the time. The original characters look and feel like they belong. The lighting and cell shading is exactly what you would expect from Breath of the Wild. The areas have been remade. Landmarks look identical, but in their proper pre-ruins form. The UI isn't exactly the same, but it feels right. No other spin-off feels as at home as this one. It is the most authentic feeling Zelda game to not come directly from the main team. And it doesn't even really play like one. And I think there's something special about that. Well, this ended up being a longer video than I thought. I know it's not exactly fair to bring up the sequel and just ask why the first game didn't do that. But at the same time, I can't deny that Age of Calamity kind of ruined this game for me. Why aren't items used more? Why is the weak point gauge barely used? Why is the story so minimal and lame? I'm not going to pretend that Age of Calamity isn't as grindy and repetitive, because it really is. But it doesn't get old because there are enough ways to accomplish the actions you'll be doing that you don't mind doing them over and over again. Hyrule Warriors is a fun game. I think it's solid, but it pales in comparison to its follow-up, and I'm not really sure how often I'll pick it up again in the future. At the very least, it spawned a pretty neat little spin-off for my favorite series, one that I hope continues to grow and evolve over time, and it's looking like it's got a fair shot. With Age of Calamity being the best-selling Musou game of all time, and Age of Imprisonment being one of the Switch 2's big holiday games in its first year, a fourth game feels all the more likely now. Maybe that next installment after Age of Imprisonment will be another series-wide spanning entry, a canon one this time. Or maybe it will also be directly related to whatever the next entry is. If there's one thing that you can never take away from the first game, it's that it's what really showed that the Zelda universe within this context could work. That it was a path worth taking. No matter what my thoughts, I really have no choice but to respect it. And sometimes, respect is enough.